Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the Future Trends Forum. I'm very glad to see and hopefully hear all of you today. My name is Brian Alexander, the forum's creator, your host, and cat herder for the next hour. I'm very excited about the topic and about our guest for today. But before we dive into that, let me just introduce the forum. Let me tell you where it comes from, what it does, who supports it, and then I'll introduce this week's guest. So to begin with, you should know the Future Trends Forum is a discussion-based platform where an area for discussing the future of education and technology. It spins off of the monthly Future Trends in Technology and Education report. Now, that's a monthly trends analysis. It's a regular publication delivered by email, which describes more than about 86 major trends reshaping education and technology. If you haven't had a chance to check it out, go to ftte.us. Download a few sample copies, and if you like it, subscribe. Now, on to the next slide, please. Now, the forum and the FTTE report are both part of my Browser project, which is the Future Education Observatory. And this is a multimedia, participatory, ongoing attempt to try to suss out where education and technology are going. If you haven't had a chance to check it out, go to futureofeducation.us. You can find links to not just the FTTE report and to this forum, but also to the blog, to the book club, the bookstore, and a few other impending projects. On to the next slide, please. Now, it's important that we think about this, the future of education and technology, in as global a perspective as possible. It's too easy for us to really shrink down and focus on a particular nation, region, or even just a subset of a region. But it's really, really important for us to think about how all these developments, all these innovations really cross international boundaries. It's possible the next big thing will come from Canada, from Japan, from Mozambique. It's possible that the major currents and changes that really shape education are actually going to be coming around the world. So as we proceed today, please think about yourselves and this topic in as global a way as possible. Now, on to the next slide, please. Before we proceed, I should thank some of the people who support the Future Trends Forum. And to begin with, I would like to thank NYSERNet. NYSERNet is a nonprofit in New York State that helps bring that state's colleges and universities to broadband connectivity. We're very grateful to them for their support. They do great work. We're also grateful to Shindig because you can tell Shindig makes available this awesome technology. So before we proceed, let me just dive into it and show you how it works. So where I am right now and where this slide is just for a minute is called the stage. Everything up here on the stage can be seen and heard by everybody who's in on this video conference. So later on, I'll show you people can beam up here and join us and converse. We have actually 4 different people up here at a time. So you can imagine this is a kind of panel. Now below us, if you look around you, you'll see what I think of as the participant swarm, or the audience. You'll see many, many different icons, some of them with video, like Karen, some of them with a silhouette, like Emily Bembenek. Each of these represents one person or several people at a sign-in. If you'd like to find out more about one of those people, just mouse over them. You'll get a little information. If you want to talk to them, double-click on them. And if they want to talk to you, your 2 icons will snap together like Legos. You can have your own private audiovisual conversation. Now, there are a lot of ways to communicate, converse, and discuss, and that's what the forum is all about. So let me show you 3 of the main tools. If you look at the bottom of the screen, you'll see a white strip running along it. That has a few different key options. So on the leftmost edge, you'll see what looks like a bunch of little heads and a number, I think 58, along a little box like a comic book dialogue strip. If you click on that, up will pop 2 different boxes. The box on the left shows you everybody who's here involved in this video conference right now. So you can just mouse over and find out that that Patrick Dixon is a professor. You can find out that Curtis Ellerson is a CEO, and so on. That's a really handy way to get a quick overview of everybody who's involved in this conversation. Now, on the right side, you'll see a chat box. And already there's a bunch of people who've been asking some questions and introducing themselves. So you can see people like Keith Hampson from Toronto, Emily, who I keep picking on, Bembenek from Chicago, Brian Marlowe from Super Hot Tampa, Roxanne, the awesome Roxanne from Connecticut, and so on. So you can use that chat box throughout this hour. Just ask questions, push out ideas. I often find people like to either make jokes, but in some ways, more importantly, they like to share resources that come up in the course of the conversation. So you'll have that chat box. Back to the white strip. You'll see next to the dialog box, you'll see a kind of question mark with a circle around it. If you highlight it, it says ask. If you click that, that gives you a chance to type in a question or a comment. Now what we can do is we can flash it on the screen for everybody to read, and I'll read out loud so everyone can hear it. And you'll see during this hour, people really like doing that. That's a quick and easy way to get comments and thoughts across. And next to that is a raised hand button, which is my favorite, because that tells us that you'd like to join us up here on the stage. So if your microphone is working, your camera is working, and you're in an environment where you can talk and listen out loud, click that when you're ready to talk, and you can join us, and you can ask Doug and myself questions. So you can click the raised hand button, you can click the question mark, you can type in the chat box. All of these are different ways to converse. So please feel as this hour unfolds that you have lots of opportunity and room to ask tricky questions, share thoughts based on your experience, criticize, push back, or celebrate what we're talking about. Now, we're very, very grateful to Shindig, who puts all this technology together. Now, over to the next slide, please. We're also very grateful to our friends on Patreon who support this. If you haven't seen Patreon, it's a crowdfunding site, kind of like Kickstarter or GoFundMe. The difference is it continually supports a creative person making stuff. And in this case, the creative person is me making all this media about the future of education. So you can see from this slide, here are some of the top contributors, people like Tom Hames, Michael Haggins, Paul McConaughey, Kyle and Bob Johnson, Robert DeRosa. All those people contribute at least $1 a month. Just make sure that we keep the lights on and keep the forum running. Please go to patreon.com/Brian Alexander if you haven't been already. We'd love to have you join us for any support you can give. We're very grateful to our patrons. Now, on to this week's show. We're very, very excited to have Doug Belkin. Doug is a reporter who works for the Wall Street Journal. He's based in Chicago, and he's been writing a lot about higher education and business over the past year. He's done some really, really great articles, really exploring the questions of affordability, sustainability, access, what the business is of higher education. I'm really grateful to him for coming for this hour. I'm really looking forward to the chance to pick his brain. And I'm sure he's going to have a bunch of great ideas and also some questions from all of you. So, Tara, why don't you just dismiss this slide and bring Doug up? Doug, welcome aboard.
Hi, how are you?
Very, very good. Thank you again for coming. Just to begin with, let me ask, I've characterized you as a reporter for the Wall Street Journal who works in higher education. What are some of the big topics that you're writing about this year? What are some of the big issues that really loom large in your writing right now?
So I've been on the higher ed beat for 6 years, and the theme of this year has been disruption and what that looks like, what it's how it's impacting schools, the folks who are trying to profit from it, the folks whose ox is potentially getting gored by it. So those are the big themes that we've been looking at this year.
Excellent. And we can start off by saying disruption in higher education has been in the air for about the past 10 years, ever since the recession hit, ever since Clayton Christensen started writing about education, since the MOOC revolution, and I think in part due to the sense of ongoing crisis and anxiety about the future of education. What are some of the sources you see now for disruption? Are they coming from inside the house, from within schools and faculty? Are they coming from outside, from governments and businesses?
I think the biggest factor from where I'm sitting looks to me to be the declining faith that Americans have in a university degree. And there's data that shows that there should be more skepticism than there has been. And I think that's just prompting a rethink of the value of a degree and how people should be spending their time and money. And that's really driving the conversation that we're writing about.
What's driving that declining faith now? I mean, is it the perception of cost? Is it anxiety about student debt? Is it worries about curriculum or outcome? Or what's the cause of anxiety now? Or that skepticism, excuse me.
Yeah, I think it's all of everything you just mentioned and a bunch more, right? So if you look at the amount of money, the advantage of how much money someone made when they graduated college versus when they graduated high school, that's been shrinking for 5 years. The cost of college has been rising. Debt is getting worse. The cohort default rate is not insignificant. It's become a really risky proposition, and we've built a system where everybody's sort of shoveled into this funnel, and the funnel's beginning to not work for a lot of people. And so this idea of looking for alternatives. And then, we wrote a lot last year about free speech and what's happening on campuses in terms of politics.
Sure.
I think that manifests itself in the Trump election. Folks were, you can see in polling, red state Republicans have a lot less faith and respect for the universities, oftentimes in their states or even in their backyards, than the coasts do. So there's a bifurcation in attitudes by politics. So that's pushing things as well. And then I think the third big rail is technology is shifting the nature of work so quickly, and universities have not kept up. It's probably as well as they need to, and so that the distance between what employers want and what universities are providing can create a friction. And we just saw this report. I'm sure everybody on the panel, you got an educated panel here. The Strata report that came out yesterday, underemployment is no joke. You get a crummy job out of the gate, that could stick with you for a decade or 2 decades or 3 decades, and that speaks to liberal arts education. I've always said we prepare you for the 5th or the 10th job. Well, that's coming under scrutiny. So just a whole host of things are squeezing together to make this $500 billion a year industry think twice.
These are huge issues, and before I dive into them, let me just remind you all, friends, this is something which I can talk about and I can ask Doug about for hours and hours. But one of the strengths of the forum is the questions and comments that you have. So please feel free to jump in with your questions using the different technological channels that I've given earlier today. And that includes Twitter, by the way. I didn't get to mention that. If you'd like to tweet at us, please use the hashtag FTTE or just tweet at me. And we've already seen a couple of people remarking about the discussion so far. Let me take a step back to the question of geography. Do you think it's possible that we're seeing a kind of red state, blue state bifurcation and support for higher education? That is, the coastal areas, the New Yorks, the New Jerseys, the Californias, the Washingtons, tend to be stronger in their faith in higher education, whereas the heartland, along the red states, the Midwest, are really changing their minds about higher education?
I think a lot of it's class and education level, and people segregate, by geography, so it's reflected that way. Obviously, the metropolitan areas have a much higher a percentage of folks who have a college degree, and they're more likely to be working in sort of the knowledge economy. They probably have family members and friends and they live in circles where everybody has degrees and stuff. So this segregation that's been going on since the 90s anyway. Has moved people away into different corners of the country. The repercussions of that are never ending.
Well, that's a huge difference. It's weird. I'm speaking. Actually, the two of us embody this kind of almost perfectly. I mean, you are in one of the great world cities in Chicago. I'm speaking to you from a very, very rural area in Vermont. So we almost got that balance, except Vermont's a blue state. Let's come back to the question. By the way, friends, we're thinking about this. You might want to think about your own area where you live and work, and consider how its attitudes are changing towards higher education. A few minutes ago, you mentioned that technology is changing the world of work, and it's definitely doing this in all kinds of ways, everything from automation to telecommuting and telework. And you said that higher education hasn't fully kept up. What are some of the ways you think that higher ed has kept up, and what are some of the big gaps that we need to fill in order to really structure higher ed towards the world of work?
So last December, I did a story out of Emory University, but this is happening in a lot of schools. Denison was another school in it, where there are these are traditional liberal arts programs, humanities programs, but they twin them with quantitative degrees, statistics, and data science. And that pathway seems to be very smart. I mean, I think the Burning Glass data shows that the most common word that employers are looking for in the descriptions of employment is an analyst. People need to be able to crunch numbers. They need to be able to analyze data. That's a huge thing moving forward. Humanities degrees that are twinning that with the traditional curriculum, I think, are beginning to meet that need, and so that's happening. But that's that's really on the high end of things. I don't know that that's really percolated across the higher education. and you see students voting with their feet, right? I mean, the number of engineers and kids who are entering engineering doubling and tripling around the country, and for good reason. And the humanities degrees are declining quickly, and that's been going on for a long time. So, and then the other big issue that seems to be taking place is, and this is nothing new, but practical experience. You remember the data that came out of the Purdue Gallup Index? College graduates who had said that they had some practical experience and applied what they'd learned in some way or shape, either a capstone project or an internship, were much more successful and satisfied with their college degree down the line. So I think Andy Chan at Wake Forest 3 years ago, wrote a sort of seminal paper, said we need to kill career services so it can be reborn at the center of the college campus, and that's happening. Slowly, painfully, but it's happening, I think. So those are, I think, the gaps in the movement that's around right now.
That's a great point. And I everywhere I go, in my work, I work with hundreds of colleges and universities every year, and I see a few traces of what you're talking about in terms of the quantitative fields rising and the drive for practical experience. At the same time, I see universities and colleges with massive investments in the humanities, and many faculty, and not just faculty, resisting the idea of practical experience, saying that college shouldn't be about workplace development, that college should be about self-discovery. It should be about the creation of knowledge independent of market forces. So that's a major gap. Who do you think is going to drive changes in this? Do you think this is going to come from university administrations? Do you think faculty will have a change? Do you think students voting with their feet will eventually drag curricula along with them? Or will this take something else, new businesses or perhaps the government?
So I see three places that are pushing and pulling on this. And I've written up one of them recently, this idea that boards of trustees who tend to be business-minded and bottom-line minded or putting presidents in who are saying, okay, we need to cut X and Y and bring in C and Q so that we can start to lift enrollment and give kids what they want. And a lot of faculty saying, wow, this is a problem. You're gutting the institution that I joined. The core of the university is being challenged here. And so these votes of no confidence are up 4 times in a decade. So this is a thing we're seeing around the country now. That's one thing. What's happening with these sort of startups in Silicon Valley that are creating these faster, cheaper pathways to workplace. Mission U is the most famous example. They got 10,000 applications for 50 spots. That's the camel's nose under the tent. That's not going anywhere. People are going to follow that because there's money to be made there. So I think that's going to drive things as well. And then the third one, and probably the biggest one, is enrollment. People are voting with their feet. And that's not news to anybody who's listening to me, I'm sure. We did a story looking at the idea of quality and enrollment, and we used the Wall Street Journal rankings as a proxy for quality. And there's a million ways to argue that is not the best or the only way to look at quality, but it is a way to do it. And the schools that were in the bottom fifth of the roughly 1,000 schools that we ranked had all shown a pretty sharp decline in enrollment, and everybody else was still doing well. So the lower schools are beginning to sag. There's a flight to quality, and then there's, of course, the demographics are just forcing this conversation to the forefront because there's just not as many kids getting out of high school now. Yeah.
Let me just. Well, please go ahead. Go ahead. Sorry.
You're writing a book on this subject. I wanted to ask you what you see as moving this thing forward.
Well, let me, before I answer that, let me just walk back a little bit for everybody who's on this conference. We've had a few guests in the past who have really dived into some of these topics in particular. So we had Nathan Graw in March, who does fantastic work at demographics. So friends, if you haven't had a chance to look at that, please go back to our YouTube channel and take a look. Graw's work on demographics and education is the cutting edge, the state of the art. Going back to Mission U, well, there's good news and bad news. The good news is we had Adam Braun as a guest last year, who had a fantastic show. If you haven't had a chance, go back and take a look at that video, everyone. But let me ask you, push back a little bit. Mission U just got bought by WeWork, and their mission is basically over. Some people think that purchase was an acqui-hire to get Adam Braun into WeWork. Does that suggest that we're just in a churn where businesses are growing and fading and going away and mutating, or is this just a much harder field to disrupt than we thought?
I think it is. I think it's a hard field to disrupt. I think the reason we've been talking about disruption for 10 years is because schools have deep, deep roots, and they're not going to go anywhere quickly. You saw Sweetbriar, the alumni, rose up and said, "Whoa, slow down. Let's save the school."
Yeah.
So that's. I think these are powerful, deep-rooted institutions with a lot of folks who care about them. That said, I think Mission U is, what is it, 20 months old, 18 months old? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I see a wave of this stuff coming, because there's so much money to be made if you can pull kids, out of a 4-year school, which they're really worried about going to. There's a lot of kids, the 40% of kids who don't graduate, or maybe that's not a good suggestion, are spending $200 billion a year. If you can tap that money by creating a better model, a faster model, a more efficient model, the incentive is huge. And I think early movers like Adam are going to do well, but there's going to be plenty who are going to come behind him for sure.
And that'll mean a lot of churn too. Some of these will also fold or get bought or just transform into something very, very different. We saw that happen with MOOCs.
Yeah, it's the Wild West now. Yeah,
it really is, which is unusual for higher education.
Right.
You mentioned one more detail before I answer your question. I'm sorry. You mentioned lower ranked schools really suffering. That is, we're not talking about a crisis that's hitting, say, Northwestern or Harvard or Stanford, but we're talking about lower ranked state schools, smaller religious private schools, for example. Do you think we're going to see a massive amount of mergers and or closures in that field? I mean, take the Wall Street Journal rankings. Let's say the bottom 20%. Is that where most of the blood is going to be shed?
Yeah, I think the consolidation is going to be the primary driver of this stuff. I think there'll be a lot more consolidation just because the roots of these schools are strong and the brand is strong, so it's worth something. But I mean, this year there's been like 6, in the last 2 months. It seems like the Mount Ida. But again, 100-year-old institutions, they've survived the Civil War and World War II and the Great Depression. Not so easy to kill. But from what I can tell, looking at the balance sheets, once the part of the endowment, if they have an endowment that they can access, is gone, then they're living on, a lot of them are living on borrowed time. Unless enrollment turns around.
Right, and right now enrollment seems to be really stuck because if we're talking about traditional age undergraduates, that population in the U.S. is declining, especially where you and I live in the Midwest and Northeast. Nathan's argument is that the push to increase more and more students is running into problems that the populations that we're reaching out to are the ones that are having the hardest time getting to or succeeding in college. On top of that, the most recent data from the National Clearinghouse, RCR, said that we have total enrollment in the U.S. has declined this spring for the 6th year in a row. So even though we're trying to get more and more people in, we're having fewer and fewer go through the door. On top of that, we have the problem with international students, which we relied on very heavily for the past 20 years. But for the past year and a half, that's been going down. I think this enrollment problem is one of the hugest hitting higher education right now. If you're a college that has massive endowments, again, think of Yale, you're buffered. But otherwise, if you're depending on tuition for your enrollment, for all of your revenue, it's going to be very, very difficult to keep going. That's, for me, that business model question is one of the most crucial. And I'm looking hard to find colleges and universities that are trying to adapt. And it might be that they're trying to end programs that aren't enrolling enough students, or they're trying to start new programs to enroll them. They're also trying to push online, trying to get as many students to the virtual doors as possible. I've seen some successes. Berklee College of Music, for example, its online branch, I believe, makes a profit that now goes to subvent and support their bricks and mortar institution. So we may see more examples of that, which is pretty exciting. But I fear we're about to hit a huge market contraction and a big market correction, which will be a real humanitarian disaster. That's my fear, to answer your question.
And so to pin you down, how big is big?
Right now, we've closed colleges and universities as long as we've had colleges and universities. There's a great Wikipedia list of these, which goes back. And we've already seen a massive, massive drop in the for-profit sector, both in terms of total enrollment and number of institutions. We're also seeing some of the early signs of this in law schools, where we're seeing law school enrollment plummeting. It's down 1970s levels. We've seen some lowest ranked law schools close. I wouldn't be surprised to see 5% of our institutions close or get consolidated, as you say, over the next 10 years, maybe less. I just came back from Pennsylvania, where the RAND Corporation did an analysis of Pennsylvania's public institutions, which is a great program. I mean, it's a wonderful success story. Pennsylvania is a big state with challenging geography, and they grew out the system with dozens of campuses, really meeting the needs of local communities. Population has plummeted. The interest has really dropped, and they are now just the RAND Corporation was saying, yeah, you have to close or fuse a bunch of these campuses. I think we'll see more of that, especially in the bleeding edge of the Rust Belt. Thinking about Ohio, thinking about Indiana, upstate New York. So let me put a stake in the ground for 5% over the next 10 years. We'll see how close I come.
Yeah, that sounds right, if not conservative, to me.
Oh dear. See, this is one of the things in my work. I try desperately to get talked out of my dark visions of where things could go. People always say, no, you're right, or you're too cheerful, which is really scary. Before I go further, we have Richard Price in the chat, who would love to chat. Richard works in the Clayton Christensen Institute, and he wants to join us. Richard, if you can, it'd be great to have you on board so that you can share some of your thoughts, since you are a professional scholar of disruption. Richard, where are you? Where are you coming from today?
I'm actually out in Palo Alto. Can you hear me okay?
Perfectly.
Yeah.
It's really good to see you. Thank you for coming.
Yeah, sure.
I just characterized you as a professional scholar of disruption. I hope that's not completely wrong.
It's what I do full time, so I'll take it. Sure.
Excellent. So let me ask, if I could, where are you seeing right now the major drivers for disruption in higher education? I mean, Doug and I just bounced off about a dozen of these. Are any of these in particular leading for you, or are there ones that we haven't covered yet that we really should?
No, I think you guys really hit the major highlights that we'd like to think about a lot, especially the faster and cheaper pathways. We're in constant touch with the Ryan Craigs of the world and the Adam Brauns, trying to figure out what they're working on. In fact, we're putting out a piece next week talking about some of our innovators worth watching, we call it, people kind of on the bleeding edge of this kind of stuff. The one that I've also been thinking about quite a bit lately is companies like Re-Up Education, companies that are focusing on really targeting the non-traditional learner, the ones that we say are the most needs intensive from a university's perspective. And we just see that it's interesting because in disruption theory, we always start with the overserved ones, people who either can't quite afford the offerings in the market, or they aren't willing to pay the premium prices that are being demanded. And right now, when you talk about working parents, when you talk about lower income students who maybe don't have the same tradition in their families of higher education, people who can serve them well and who can cater to their needs are eventually going to be able to move up market as well, and give a lot of these universities a run for their money. So we're really intrigued by.
Oh, I think we just had your connection slow down. Okay, Richard, we're going to try you again to make sure that you can come back up. Doug, can you still, you're able to hear him though, aren't you?
I did hear him, yeah. And I've read a bunch of your stuff, so it's nice to see you in person.
Oh, good. Well, this is what I love about this, is being able to connect people. Okay, Richard, you're back?
Yeah. Sorry, I lost you for a second there.
That's okay. The connection just froze just for a second. But you were talking about some of these new startups like Re-Up that are targeting non-traditional learners and trying to go after underserved and challenged populations. So yeah, that's a new field.
Yeah, that's the main thing I'd say that we tend to. That's maybe the secret sauce that we can add from the Institute, is talking about that portion of learners that don't always get attention from the mainstream institutions.
Correct. Are any of those working on competency-based education?
The biggest ones are Western Governors University and Southern New Hampshire University, and they are pretty mainstream and pretty well known. We see WG's model is highly disruptive, and we've been a big fan of theirs for a long time.
These are friends. If I go too quickly about this, these are programs that recognize somebody's achievement and the skills and their knowledge that they've obtained outside of formal education, and then they can translate that into some form of credit within formal education. So competency-based education, or CBE, is the term of art. Richard, what do you think is going to happen in terms of resistance to these programs within, or these developments within higher education? We have a lot of people who are skeptical, as you know, of the Christensen model. We have a lot of faculty and some administrators who say that higher education does wonderful stuff, that is very, very successful, very powerful, very culturally influential, and maybe it shouldn't be subject to the kind of logics of Silicon Valley. How do you see those resistances shaping out and playing out in the next few years?
Well, I do think that some of that resistance is kind of due to a bit of a misunderstanding, right? The term disruption gets thrown around left and right, and it's the buzzword for everything. And the definition of disruptive innovation in disruption theory is actually pretty rigorous and pretty specific. We're not out advocating that things need to be upturned or destroyed. We see disruptive innovation as a force that increases access and improves affordability. And so if there are forces in the market that bring down costs and that increase availability of higher education, that's the kind of stuff we really hope happens. And a lot of times I think some startups might come across with some rather brash language or some stuff that might be abrasive to the traditional higher education community. And that dialogue is what it is. We don't try to exacerbate it. But to the extent that it's serving learners and helping them get better jobs, we think that there's room for all these players in the market. And we just hope that everyone can get what they need. And if they're having to throw extra money into a traditional institution than what they need for their goals, then we're glad that there are alternative providers that are helping them out.
Excellent. That's a good response. Thank you. Then let me ask a question for both of you, since I've got you both here. This is great. And again, friends, if you're new to this technology or to the forum, this is the kind of three-way conversation we can easily have. We have a question posed to us earlier this week by Michael Johnson, a longtime friend of the program. And he wants to know about your thoughts about the divide between trades, skilled and semi-skilled trades, and college education. That is, do you think we will see higher education or parts of higher education reach out more to try to do more to support people working in everything from HVAC to carpentry to diesel technology? Or do you think we'll see more and more of the population peel away from higher education, voting with their feet, as you said before, Doug, and pursuing lives and careers completely beyond colleges and universities?
It seems to me that the apprentice model, which will to some extent bridge this gap, is going to grow in this country because it takes a lot of the risk away from the traditional path for a degree. The idea of working a little bit before you go to school in general. 10 years ago, people hadn't heard of a gap year. That's become a really big phenomenon now. I think that's probably going to get honed more and more. We're seeing. I'm sitting in Chicago. We have one of the community colleges working with Aon, an insurance company that has an apprenticeship program now. Like, these are early days for these white-collar apprenticeships, but I could see them being a much bigger deal and connecting with a lot more institutions of higher education. I think that the schools will be looking for them as well because, you give the people what they want. There's going to be an element of that.
Apprenticeships, definitely. And gap years are fantastic. In Ireland right now, in Irish higher education, it's pretty commonplace for people to take a gap year between high school and college. Richard, while we have you, what do you think about the trade question? Do you think we'll see a growing number of programs like the apprenticeships Doug described?
I think so. One of disruption theory's younger, lesser-known siblings is what we call modularity theory. It talks a lot about internships, right? Right now, we feel like the connection between higher education and the workforce it's a complicated one and one that we haven't really mastered and fully figured out. So programs and companies that can bridge that gap and kind of take over both sides, both the training and offering jobs, we think there's a lot of opportunity there. And we think that's going to grow a lot. People are just starting to tap into the potential for it. And you have some startups doing it. You have some consulting firms doing it. And I'm glad that a lot of community colleges especially are also jumping into the fray. So that I think is going to be huge.
Richard, can I ask you, who do you see that's bridging the gap now? What are the organizations that are doing it now?
So some smaller ones that we've seen are companies like Reviture or Catalyte. They focus very much on the IT consulting or software development side, but they give you both the boot camp and the job or connection straight to employers. And then, I mean, I even remember looking to companies like schools like Penn Foster, like these online for-profit providers that they interface directly with like HVAC technician companies and such, and they fund education and also link you directly to the job. So trying to think if there are any like larger providers. Those are the ones I've been looking into more recently, though. Kind of these boot camp / 2 years of work kind of models.
So it seems like they're moving into the space where the community colleges traditionally lived, but the community colleges haven't been able to fill it effectively. I don't know if you see any hope for on the community college level if they can, to do some of these same things.
I think to the extent that, so we've seen a lot in the last couple of months, reports coming out from like Burning Glass and such about degree inflation. There's this dialogue that maybe the bachelor's isn't what everybody needs. And I think as the labor market has tightened and people are realizing that more and more, I think community colleges are getting less of a bad rap. They were always seen as people who couldn't quite get a bachelor's, they can always go to community college. I think now people are really looking at community college as a legitimate option from day one. So I think that that increased demand is also making community colleges grapple with what these students actually want. I think community colleges are going to be fine. When we hear about schools closing down at small liberal arts private universities, it's not so much colleges. I don't see them disappearing or anything.
Well, it is in many ways. Since community colleges do such tremendous work with relatively few resources, very little in the way of public attention, very few in the way of tenured track faculty. And they're usually pretty young, too. They're not centuries old. They're usually dating back to the 60s in many ways. Tara, we have a question from Steve Cavello. Let's see if we can bring him up on stage to join us. We can have all four of us argue at the same time. And while we're bringing him up, if we can do that, let me just put this quickly to the two of you, Richard and Doug. Do you think it's well, actually, let me hold off on that. Let me let Steve go, because Steve had a really good question. Steve, greetings to New Hampshire.
Hello, Brian. Hello, everybody. Thanks again for letting me share the stage with you folks. I'm glad that we have someone who's got sort of the Clayton Christensen perspective on this, because my comment, which isn't really a question, has a lot to do with disruption. And I should just mention that I've made a very long response to Brian's blog post on this very topic, which describes a much longer drawn-out case study that I use as a parallel for this. So I'm not going to repeat that here. So instead, I'm just going to read off here what I've written in advance. The comment I have is that as colleges contract, it will not mean less education and less learning, rather that the education will simply happen someplace else, and that is more relevant or accessible to learners. And the evidence I offer here for this case is the complete collapse of the video post-production industry in New York City in the early 2000s. And what has emerged instead has been a more self-reliant, self-defined community of video producers that is producing more video than at any time in human history. So really what the question here, as I see it, is how do we redefine higher education as being relevant to an audience of people who are not necessarily seeing the value proposition as we have constructed it. They are seeing the value proposition in the way they have constructed it. And they no longer see what we do as voodoo, and they no longer need our infrastructure to do it. So I guess that's just my comment. I'm not sure if there's a question in there, but I'm curious to know how you react to that.
Doug, Richard, what do you think?
It sounds like you're calling into question whether the value of the credential will matter, and it's a really important and good question, right? So there's this whole idea that skills and the proof of skills will supplant the credentials, which have become more of a signal, but that signal is getting weaker, because of grade inflation and whatnot. But if you can prove the specific skills that an employer wants to have, that's going to get you the job, and that's the credential that people care about. That I think it's Adam Braun's line from Mission U, but it rings true.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Well, I guess that is certainly a component of it, but my kids are nearly 12 and 13, and they have been learning things with zero input from me in ways that I could not have imagined, and they are learning in ways in which I was not educated as an instructional designer as the way people learn. What I'm finding, in which is sort of part of the supporting component of this opinion, is that the whole idea of the necessity for there to even be teachers, much less a physical location for teaching to take place, is becoming less relevant. And my kids are becoming extraordinarily frustrated by the fact that they cannot learn in class as quickly as they can learn on their own. So I just wonder what this is going to be like in 5, 7, 8 years or so when they become college age and they're entering into an environment that we have constructed based on 19th century principles and or 20th century principles. So it's an interesting thing to imagine what I will be doing as a higher education instructional designer to support this generation in the next few years.
Really interesting. I'll share a quick conversation I had with a 19-year-old kid the other day who said he doesn't go to class. He's a super bright kid, pre-med. He said, I go to my dorm and put on Khan Academy at 2X at the week before the final. And he's acing it. He's doing great. He's knocking it out of the park. That's how he's learning. Medical schools the lecture halls are empty because they're doing essentially the same thing. And there's all these companies that are, so yeah, bingo. That's and what happens to that that's a really important question and a really interesting one. And I have no idea.
Well, it could be that maybe I was too conservative. Oh, please go ahead, Richard.
Yeah, just really quickly. You did mention the necessity for a physical location for teachers.
Mm-hmm.
I think the physical location part is diminishing in importance. People are finding ways to use online platforms for very active discussion-based learning. And I think that's where teachers will always be valuable. Dissemination of facts and just delivery of content, that maybe is not going to be as needed. But having someone who can moderate a discussion and help people apply and transport their knowledge from one domain to another, I think that's where higher ed really can still give a great value add.
I agree. And the problem that I have with that is how we as an institution can convey the value of that and make the connection between that value proposition, as you've just described, and the cost. The credential is great, but really what we're talking about in the forefront of families' minds, including mine, is are we willing to spend that much money to have that advantage, as you've just described? It's a very interesting proposition.
Well, that's a great question. Thank you. And thank you, Steve, for bringing that. I look forward to seeing where your children take us. But we have another question that has just come up from Liz Fadden, I think. So let's see if we can bring Liz up on stage. I'm sorry, Liz McFadden. Sorry, I didn't mean to remove you from Scotland. Liz, welcome.
Hi. It's actually Liza, but that's okay. I'm used to going by Liz or Lisa, whatever you want to call me.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Hi, Liza. Where are you coming from today?
Florida.
Oh, excellent, excellent. Where it's probably a little warm right now.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Well,
We've been in the rain for 2 weeks straight.
That's the tropics for you. So you had a question about income share agreements. Can you explain? Go ahead.
Yeah, so I know the Wall Street Journal has covered income share agreements, sort of from the perspective of what they are and the benefits. But I'm really interested because they're starting to grow at a much faster rate. Norwich College, for example, just came on a couple days ago. If this couldn't, so I believe in survival. So I'm going to say I don't believe 5% are going to close because I think that there's going to be huge innovation in this space. And I think that those who are at the greatest risk of closure are also the greatest risk takers. And so therefore, I'm really interested as I look at ISAs and the fact that really the universities own the ISA, right, in their development, and that strategically they're selecting students who, for the most part, much like how the K-12 has re-engineered charter schools and scholarships that are going to private kids, right, most of that money coming from corporate income tax, that this new strategy, which I believe will focus on the most needy colleges, most needy students, and those students being the most interested in getting a job when they graduate, I think this could really change the dynamic of what colleges end up offering. And Doug, I'd love your sort of thoughts about the trajectory of ISAs for this country.
One thing occurs to me, and that is that schools have resisted kicking and screaming, having any skin in the game in terms of the outcomes of the students who are going to their schools, and that's been, I think, bad for higher education. So what these ISAs do is exactly that, right? So it limits the risk for the kids because it's on the back end, but it increases the risks for the institutions. I've not thought deeply about this stuff. We've written when the Bet on a Boilermaker came out. I think we wrote that story, and we've done a couple others. We've tried to track at the federal level. There's a lot of lip service in Washington about accountability in higher education, and there's not that much happens. So I think in the Senate right now they're debating the skin on the game thing. I don't think Washington is going to lead, I guess, is the short of it. The ISA makes a lot of sense to me. We're seeing it happen. In the boot camps and the startups. So it makes sense to me that what Purdue has done will be, and what you just said Norwich has done, I wasn't aware of that, will pick up steam. I don't have any deep insights as to how, though.
Well, because when I think about this arena, I think the finances end up driving the change. And one of the things I've been trying to think about is the colleges design it, and you see that the boot camps, to your point, are really on the leading edge of it. If in fact it gets offered to small segments of students, because in Purdue, right, I think it started with 400 students and just juniors and seniors, and now they've expanded to all 4 years in a much wider array. So I think that kind of pace makes me think that it has potential to grow in other areas. And I do think it might be segmented to areas where colleges think they can show great alignment to folks getting a job right away, because it's in their best interest to do so, because that's how they get paid back.
Yeah.
And if I may just really quickly.
Please.
I had a chance to sit in kind of a closed room discussion with a prominent ISA provider and a few other higher ed stakeholders who are all bringing different questions about, yes, on the one side, accountability is great. On the other side, want to avoid predatory behaviors. I was quite impressed at the very thorough extent to which ISA providers are looking out to protect students. And that's where I think the regulatory oversight is going to be a huge deal. Right now, private finance and private universities will lead the way in implementing, but they're going to have a lot of oversight. And that's what I think we are trying to talk to Congress about. We're trying to get a seat at the table to help them design those oversights in ways that don't stifle the potential for ISAs, because they can do so much good. But at the same time, we can't have it be another for-profit scandal like we saw recently. So it will certainly be targeted at certain students initially. They're finding ways to broaden it for a number of different majors, a number of different fields of study, and realistically knowing what the market demands are for them to work in those fields later, and also do a good job of protecting students. I left very relieved that it wasn't going to become just another scam, honestly.
Well, that's good to know. I hope you're right about this later on as it develops.
Yeah, I couldn't at the time because of some non-disclosure agreements, but that's going to be so.
Well, appreciate that.
Thank you both.
Liza, that's a terrific question. Thank you very much. Thank you. We have another question that came in, if I may, which tweaks the conversation a little bit by diving into a particular area, which is about textbooks and open education. On the one hand, we've been seeing this perpetual push, incrementally growing every year, to drive cheaper and cheaper textbooks. We've seen this from Creative Commons licensing. We've seen Z degrees from Tidewater Community College and others. You know, the attempt to really just drag down the price students end up paying for textbooks. At the same time, that while those prices look pretty eye-popping at times, that's a very small part of the overall business of higher education. Are you optimistic about this, about open education materials for learning, or do you think that's just overdone, that too small part of the game?
Oh, I think we're just at the beginning of this. Yeah, I think that this will be the norm in the not too distant future, because it makes sense. Because the internet has just made things, has just opened up everything. I mean, look at my industry, right? I mean, newspapers. There's no knowledge industry that hasn't been deeply impacted by the transparency and of what is it? The knowledge wants to be free, right? All this stuff. So I don't see how this doesn't continue to pick up speed. And I think in a generation, people will look back at the idea of a $350 textbook that is insane.
Yeah, we don't often talk about OER too much. Like we talk about disruptive innovation and sustaining ones, right? They're different in that sustaining ones kind of, they're improvements, incremental improvements over time to help an existing market. We think open textbooks are a great sustaining innovation. We think that it helps lower cost students. In terms of higher, it's a piece of the pie, but we don't talk about it too much at the Institute.
This came up about a year ago. We had the professor Sarah Goldrick as a guest. You probably know her. She's a wonderful, wonderful scholar about the ways that the financial aid structure, which is really built in the 60s and 70s, is now starting to fail a lot of students. And she pointed out that although the cost of a textbook can be small as a proportion of higher education, just having to pay that $500 for a biology book can sometimes drive students out of college completely. It can be that real breaking point. Thank you both. Those are good questions or good answers to a really good question from Michael Johnson. We have another question, or a comment, which, let's see, this is from Doyle. Let's see if we can flash this on the screen. Doyle states that it seems like the assumption students are gaining knowledge to validate schools in the academy in the form of a credential, when in fact, students might value the transition into a new ecosystem. So if I understand you, Doyle, that's you're seeing us at a transition moment where students aren't as much interested in credentials, but they're trying to drive us and participate in the transition to a new learning ecosystem. If I'm paraphrasing that correctly, Doug, Richard, would you have comments to say in response to that?
The status quo at universities with regard to learning gains it's been the single largest frustration that I've had as a reporter covering this beat. It is a black box that is very difficult to pry open. It's the central thing that universities purport to do, and it's not so easy to figure out if it's working. And it's a complicated question. There's a lot of different things at play, but we did a project last year looking at the collegiate learning assessment, sort of following in the footsteps of Roskam and Aram to do that. And we published the names of the schools and the delta from freshman year to senior year of the critical learning assessment. And that some of the really high-end schools didn't do very well, and some of the no-name schools did very well. So this idea of what people are learning and where should be central to the conversation. I have a nephew who's going to be heading off to school in a couple of years, and that's my conversation with my sisters, was where are the kids learning? Where are the intellectual expectations high? Don't worry about the basketball team as much as what can you discern from how serious intellectual process is happening on campus. I guess I'm a little bit of a tangent to what that question was, but it does seem to me like that is the essence of college, and whether you're doing that in a vocational setting, in a liberal arts setting, it is really sort of the central point.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, it seems, Doug, from what you're doing with Doyle's comment, is going back to Steve's idea of this idea of an emergent student-based ecosystem where people learn in ways that we're not really structured to support very much right now. Friend, I'm conscious of time, and we have basically less than 5 minutes left to go. And we have a video question from Nancy Gibson. Let's see if we can bring Nancy up on stage. She has a question about, I believe, vocational colleges and universities.
Hi there, can you hear me?
I can hear you, but I can't see you. Can you hear us okay?
I can hear
there you
you.
are. Fantastic. Welcome.
Thank you. So what do you think vocational colleges and traditional universities and colleges can learn from each other? What does each one do best and what does each one do worst?
Before they answer quickly, where are you coming from today?
So I'm from outside Nashville, Tennessee, Austin Peay State University. We're a regional comprehensive university.
That's right. Welcome. Well,
Thank
gentlemen,
you.
what do you think?
Doug, you want to start? Spotlight's yours.
You know, I'll go back to that Purdue Gallup Index, right? What surveys of a lot of college graduates found was that people who used the information that they learned in class remembered it better, use it more. It was just a better education. I think that vocational schools, that's what they do. That to me is the biggest takeaway. You have to be able to apply what you're doing. I don't know enough about how vocational schools work to answer, correctly. The wrap on them, right, is that if you don't have enough theory and understand things in the abstract, then you won't be as good at learning, being agile to learn down the road. I don't know if that's true, but that would seem to be the corollary to the first part.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I don't know a lot either. And so this may be showing some of my ignorance too, as far as vocational schools versus traditional colleges, and just thinking about how education is going to shift and how are there potential partnerships down the road for each of those to reinvigorate each other.
Well, we're seeing it colleges are beginning to absorb these coding boot camps, right?
Right.
Those are vocational training programs. So yeah, I think you're right.
You can possibly see a little hint of that in makerspaces, which show up even at the most elite institutions. They're not full programs, but it gives you a taste of carpentry, woodworking, macrame, robotics, whatever. Terrific question. Thank you, Nancy.
Thank you.
I'm afraid, friends, we are at the end of the hour. We have raced through 60 minutes at top speed, and I'm going to have to wrap things up. So let me thank my fantastic guest, Doug. What a treat having you on here. It's really been a pleasure. Richard, thank you for being dragged on as a part-time guest. We're going to circle back and bring you on as a guest later on this year. I'm going to come after you for that. That'd be great. And Doug, where can we find you online? Is it mostly through your articles in the Wall Street Journal?
Only through the articles in the Wall Street Journal, yeah.
Okay. And you're on Twitter. We have your Twitter handle.
Yeah, Twitter.
Excellent. Well, please keep writing. Your work is vital, and I hope we all get to read it. Thank you.
Thanks. Very kind of you. Thank you.
My pleasure. Okay, well, friends, before you all leave, let me just quickly point out a couple of things for the next couple of weeks. So one is to point out that next week we have the Vice President of Academic Affairs and the founding provost of College Unbound, which is a fascinating, innovative, new institution doing some really, really risky and very creative things. We're very privileged to have Adam on board. So please save your questions for next week. And also, I have a couple of questions to point out to all of you. Our book club has just finished reading Cory Doctorow's terrific science fiction novel, Walkaway. So all the blog posts are there, so you can go back and read and follow up. And we had Cory as a guest last week, and we have that recording on the YouTube channel. So one thing for you to think about is what we should read next. I'm going to ask you again later, but if you have any quick thoughts about that, besides obviously reading Doug Belkin's columns, please let me know. And one other thing to think about, I'm going to come back to you in a big way. The forum is now almost 2.5 years old. We have more than 100 YouTube recordings. We really are at the stage where we have to think about the next phase in the forum and where it goes from here. So I'm going to be asking people in various ways to think about this. I'd love to hear your thoughts. So in terms of who you think we should invite as new guests, if we should change the structure of individual sessions, how we should reach out to other people for partnerships, and how else we can grow and bring more people into the forum. So I want to put that bug in your collective ear, and we're going to come back to that. Now, if you'd like to continue talking about this, you can obviously reach out to me, but we're also very, very active in social media. So Tara, if you can just page forward to the social media screen. You can find me on Twitter, Brian Alexander, or go to brianalexander.org to get the blog posts. You can find Shindig all over Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn, as you can see here. If you'd like to add some more comments on Twitter, just use the hashtag FTTE, and we'd be glad to hear you. Again, let me thank everybody. Let me thank our terrific guests, our terrific questioners for a high-octane, rapid-paced, really interesting glimpse at the future of education. Thank you all, and we'll see you next week. Bye-bye.